Welcome to the Soul Dark Romance Stories. The channel will bring you stories of strong bonds, cultural differences, passionate love, and unforgettable dramatic events. If you love interracial love stories and cinematic storytelling, then this is the place for you. Enjoy listening. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more great stories. $80 million do not simply disappear. Not from a network as careful and paranoid as the Kong Syndicate. Yet that was exactly what everyone in the room was staring at on the screen mounted along the conference wall. The number glowed in quiet accusation, while 12 senior captains of the organization sat around a long black table in a private office overlooking the Seattle harbor. Outside the windows, container ships drifted slowly through Elliott Bay, steel giants carrying cargo that made men like my husband powerful. Inside the room, that power felt suddenly fragile. Kong Jae-hoon stood at the head of the table, hands resting against the polished surface, his expression carved into the calm mask he wore during every crisis. He controlled one of the most efficient logistics empires on the West Coast. Freight companies, warehouse chains, discreet transport routes that moved goods no customs officer ever inspected too closely. When he entered a room, people usually listened. Tonight they were not looking at him. They were looking at the empty column on the financial report where $80 million used to be. The family's chief financial advisor tapped the screen with a pen. The money did not vanish in a single transfer, he explained carefully. It left the system gradually over 6 months. Hundreds of smaller transactions routed through subsidiary companies. A murmur moved around the table. That kind of pattern meant planning, discipline, someone with access to the internal accounts. Another advisor leaned forward. Who had that level of access? The answer arrived before the question finished echoing. My name, Aisha Coleman. For a moment, no one said anything else. I stood near the back wall of the conference room, close enough to see the numbers on the screen, but far enough away that no one had to pretend I belonged at the table. I had spent years in rooms like this one, listening to conversations that technically did not include me. The captains of the organization rarely hid their opinions. Tonight, those opinions settled quickly. Madame Kong was the first to speak. Jae-hoon's mother sat 2 chairs to his right, dressed in dark silk, her posture straight and unmovable. She had built much of the family's power long before her son inherited it. When she spoke, people listened. We warned Jae-hoon about letting outsiders handle family records, she said calmly. Outsiders. The word carried across the room like a quiet verdict. One of the captains nodded. She used to work in financial investigations, correct? Another voice followed. Forensic accounting. Several heads turned toward me. I met Jae-hoon's eyes. All he needed to do was say one sentence. She didn't do it. That was all. Instead, he lowered his gaze toward the report in front of him, as if the numbers demanded his full attention. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. In this room, silence from the boss meant agreement. The council discussed the situation for several minutes after that. Their voices remained controlled, practical. Someone had to be responsible. Someone had to explain how $80 million slipped through their system without detection. Eventually, the decision formed the way these decisions always did. Calmly, efficiently. My access to financial records would be revoked immediately. Until the missing money was located, I would be considered the primary suspect. No one asked me for an explanation. I stepped forward just enough that everyone could hear me clearly. If that is what the family believes, I said quietly, then I understand. A few men nodded, satisfied the problem had found a convenient shape. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, the discussion resumed, voices lowering as they debated how to recover the missing money. But as I stepped into the hallway, one thought settled clearly in my mind. They were all asking the wrong question. I was not always the quiet woman standing at the back of a crime family meeting. Long before I became Aisha Coleman Kong, the wife who hosted charity dinners and smiled politely through conversations that were not meant for her. I spent my days chasing numbers that powerful people hoped no one would ever follow. I worked in Chicago as a forensic accountant for a private investigative firm that specialized in corporate fraud. My job was simple in theory and exhausting in practice. I studied financial systems until I could see patterns most people ignored. Money always left fingerprints. It just required patience to find them. When companies tried to hide millions inside shell corporations and fake charities, they usually failed because someone like me eventually mapped the trail. I met Kang Jae-hoon during one of those investigations. At the time, he was not yet the most powerful logistics broker on the West Coast, but he was already moving quickly toward that position. His company had hired our firm to audit a transportation subsidiary that had been quietly losing money. When I presented the final report, Jae-hoon asked more questions than any client I had ever worked with. He did not ask them like a businessman worried about profit. He asked them like a strategist studying how systems could be manipulated. I noticed his intelligence immediately. He noticed something about me too. Months later he called again, but that time it was not about accounting. It was dinner. For a while our relationship felt surprisingly normal. Jae-hoon never pretended that his world was simple. He ran shipping routes and warehouse networks that crossed legal boundaries often enough to keep lawyers permanently employed. Still, he respected my work. He liked the way I explained complicated financial structures, as if they were puzzles waiting to be solved. When he proposed marriage 2 years later, he told me something I believed completely at the time. He said my mind was the sharpest weapon he had ever seen. The change did not happen all at once after the wedding. It came slowly, almost politely. The Kang family welcomed me in public gatherings, but kept a careful distance whenever business conversations began. Madame Kang never openly insulted me, yet she rarely missed an opportunity to remind people that I came from outside the family's traditions. At dinner, she asked me about charity projects or interior decoration, while the men at the table discussed shipping schedules and new casino licenses. Jae-hoon noticed the divide, but he interpreted it differently than I did. He thought he was protecting me from the dangerous parts of his empire. Every time I offered an opinion about finances, he would smile gently and tell me not to worry about the business. He handled those things with his advisors. Eventually, I stopped trying to argue my way into those conversations. Not because I lost interest, but because I realized something important about power. People reveal more when they believe you are not paying attention. 6 months before the $80 million crisis exploded inside the family, I was sitting at our kitchen counter reviewing a stack of financial summaries that one of Jae-hoon's assistants had accidentally left behind. It was late in the evening. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of cargo ships moving through the harbor. I scanned the documents out of habit more than curiosity, but one line of numbers caught my attention immediately. A small transfer had moved out of one of the syndicate's transportation subsidiaries into a consulting firm I did not recognize. The amount was modest, $200,000, but the pattern around it did. 2 days later, another transfer appeared in the records. $300,000 this time. Different company, different routing path. The destination changed again, but the method felt familiar. I had seen structures like this before in fraud cases. Instead of stealing a large amount all at once, someone moved money slowly through dozens of minor transactions that blended into normal accounting activity. I mentioned the irregularity to Jae-hoon that night while he was reviewing shipping manifests in his office. He listened patiently for about 30 seconds before leaning back in his chair with a tired smile. He said the advisors managed those accounts carefully and that I was probably misreading internal adjustments between subsidiaries. The conversation ended there. 2 weeks later, the transfers continued. This time I printed several transaction records and placed them on his desk. The pattern was clearer now. Nearly $2 million had moved through various companies in less than a month. Jae-hoon barely glanced at the documents before sliding them aside. "You don't need to dig into this," he said. "My people handle the financial structure." His people. The phrase lingered in the air longer than he intended. I realized then that my role in the empire he commanded had quietly changed. I was no longer the forensic accountant whose instincts he once admired. I had become his wife, a position that carried status but very little authority. So I stopped bringing him evidence. Instead, I began following the money alone. Every night after the house went quiet, I opened the internal reports that circulated through Jae-hoon's office network and copied the transaction trails into a private spreadsheet on my laptop. Slowly, the map of transfers expanded. Hundreds of thousands turned into millions. The funds moved through freight companies, casino service vendors, shipping insurance accounts, and several nonprofit organizations tied loosely to the Kang family's charitable foundations. None of the movements triggered the automated alerts the advisors relied on because each individual transfer looked harmless. But when I added them together, the number grew quickly. 10 million, 20, 30. By the end of the 4th month, I understood exactly what was happening. The money was not disappearing. It was being redirected through an intricate funnel designed to remove funds from Jehun's operational accounts without attracting attention. I leaned back in my chair that night and stared at the total on my screen. $80 million was moving through the system, and no one inside the organization seemed to notice. Except me. By the end of the 4th month, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The money moving through the Kong network was not random leakage or accounting error. It was disciplined, deliberate, and patient. Whoever designed the system understood exactly how internal audits worked and exactly how to stay beneath their radar. Small withdrawals from logistics subsidiaries were routed through consulting firms tied to our casino operations. From there, the funds flowed through charitable foundations that technically existed for community programs. Finally, the money disappeared into a quiet investment account registered under a private holding group no one inside the family ever mentioned during meetings. Every piece of the structure looked ordinary on its own. Together, it formed a tunnel wide enough to move $80 million without triggering a single alarm. I sat in the dark kitchen staring at the screen long after the realization settled in. The house was silent except for the distant horns of ships entering the harbor. That was the moment I understood something more troubling than the money itself. Whoever built this system had been doing it in plain sight for months. They had counted on the fact that the family trusted its advisors more than anyone else. And they had counted on one more thing. They had counted on the fact that no one would listen to me. The simplest option would have been to confront Jehun immediately with the full map of transactions. I had already traced the money through 14 different shell companies and 5 nonprofit organizations. The evidence was clear enough that any trained accountant could see the scheme within minutes. But I remembered the way he dismissed the first 2 warnings. I remembered the quiet smile he used whenever he told me not to worry about the business. In Jehun's world, loyalty flowed through blood and hierarchy before logic ever entered the conversation. If I exposed the system too early, the advisors would deny everything and Madame Kong would defend them without hesitation. My evidence would become an accusation from an outsider. So I waited. Instead of confronting the family, I began documenting every movement of money with the patience that had once made me valuable to investigative firms. Each night, I copied transaction records into a private database that existed only on my laptop. I built visual charts showing the routes each payment followed through the network. When new shell companies appeared, I mapped their ownership structures. When the advisors approved another internal transfer, I recorded the authorization codes. Slowly, the picture sharpened until the entire structure of the laundering funnel stood in front of me like a blueprint. 600 individual transfers, 14 companies, 5 foundations, 1 final destination. By the time the 6th month began, the total siphoned from the organization had reached $80 million. The advisors still behaved as if nothing unusual was happening. They attended council meetings, discussed port expansions, and congratulated themselves on record profits from the casino network. Watching them across the conference table felt almost surreal. They believed the system they built was invisible. Then the container seizure happened. The authorities intercepted a cargo shipment worth nearly $40 million outside Tacoma. Officially, the seizure had nothing to do with the missing funds. But inside the Kong organization, panic spread quickly. Financial stress exposed weaknesses. When Jehun demanded a full internal review of the accounts, the advisors suddenly needed an explanation for the slow bleeding of money that had gone unnoticed for half a year. They found one easily. Me. Within hours of the seizure, Madame Kong called for an emergency council meeting. I watched the advisors present carefully prepared summaries that highlighted my past access to certain accounting reports. They described my background in financial investigations as if it were evidence of criminal intent rather than professional training. Each sentence pushed the narrative toward the conclusion they wanted. Aisha Coleman had the skills. Aisha Coleman had access. Aisha Coleman must have taken the money. What surprised me was not the accusation itself. I had expected that possibility since the night I discovered the laundering funnel. What surprised me was Jehun's reaction, or rather his lack of one. He listened to the advisors present their theory while staring at the table in front of him. Once or twice his eyes flickered toward me, but he never interrupted the discussion. Not when Madame Kong implied that my foreign background made me difficult to trust. Not when one of the captains suggested my old investigative work meant I knew how to hide money. The room slowly reached its conclusion while he remained silent. That silence hurt more than the accusation. Still, it also confirmed what I had already suspected. Jihun trusted the structure of his family more than he trusted the woman he married. The advisors knew that. They built their entire defense around it. When the council finally revoked my access to the financial systems and named me the primary suspect, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Relief. Because the moment they blamed me publicly, the advisors stopped worrying about covering their tracks. They believed the investigation had ended. They believed the family had already chosen its scapegoat. 3 days later, Jihun called for another emergency meeting to address the growing panic among the captains. By then, rumors about the missing 80 million had spread through every level of the organization. The meeting would gather every major lieutenant in one room. Exactly the audience I needed. I spent the night before the meeting organizing my files into a presentation simple enough that even the most skeptical captain could follow it. Each transfer appeared on the screen in chronological order. Lines connected the shell companies until the funnel became visible to anyone willing to look. At the center of the diagram sat the investment account where the money had accumulated quietly for half a year. The next morning, I walked into the headquarters building carrying my laptop and nothing else. Inside the conference room, the advisors were already explaining why the organization needed to move forward without the $80 million. They spoke about restructuring the shipping network and tightening internal controls. When the door opened behind them, every head turned. I walked to the center of the room and placed the laptop on the table. "You were all looking for a thief," I said calmly. The room fell silent. But the real question is this. How did $80 million leave the system over 6 months without any of you noticing? Then I opened the files and let the money speak for itself. The moment the screen lit up, the atmosphere inside the conference room shifted. The captains who had been speaking confidently only seconds earlier fell silent as rows of numbers began appearing across the display. Each line showed a transaction. Each arrow showed the direction the money had moved. At first, the diagram looked complicated, but as the pattern expanded, the structure became obvious even to people who had never studied accounting in their lives. The transfers were small individually, but together they formed a steady river of money leaving the organization. One of the captains leaned forward. "What exactly are we looking at?" he asked. 612 transactions, I replied. Every one of them approved internally. Every one of them routed through companies that belonged to this organization. I tapped a key and the next screen appeared. The lines connected, forming a funnel that narrowed toward a single point. For 6 months, I continued, money moved out of the shipping subsidiaries through casino vendors, through charity foundations, and into one private investment account. The room grew quieter with every word. One of the advisors finally spoke, his voice tight with irritation. "That proves nothing. Internal transfers happen constantly." "Yes," I said calmly. "They do. But internal transfers usually serve a purpose." I zoomed in on the final destination. The account name appeared in large letters at the center of the screen. Several captains shifted in their seats. They recognized it immediately. It belonged to a private investment group that had quietly appeared in the family's financial orbit only a year earlier. Until that moment, most of the captains believed it was simply another holding company connected to Madame Kang's charitable network. I turned back toward the table. $80 million is sitting in that account right now. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced inside the Kong organization before. The advisors who had accused me only days earlier looked suddenly unsure of where to direct their attention. One of the captains stood up halfway from his chair. "Who authorized this?" he demanded. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I pulled up another page. The screen filled with authorization logs. Every transfer required 2 internal approvals. The system was designed that way to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. One authorization came from the financial office that monitored casino revenue. The second came from the consulting division that handled logistics contracts. 2 names appeared repeatedly beside the approvals. Both men were sitting in the room. Neither of them spoke. A ripple of disbelief moved through the captains as they began recognizing the pattern. These advisors had worked with the Kong family for nearly 2 decades. They had survived multiple leadership changes and were considered among the most loyal members of the organization. One of them finally stood up. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "Those funds were being secured for strategic investment." I shook my head. "If that were true," I said, "the transfers would have been reported to Jehun." The advisor turned toward my husband. "Chairman Kong, you know we would never act against the family." Jehun had not moved since the presentation began. He stood at the head of the table staring at the screen while the pattern of transactions continued glowing across the display. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he stepped forward. "Why wasn't I informed about the reserve account?" he asked quietly. The advisor hesitated. That pause was all the confirmation the captains needed. Another captain slammed his hand on the table. "You moved $80 million without telling the boss." The second advisor tried to intervene. "We were protecting the organization." "From what?" someone demanded. The room erupted into overlapping voices. Years of loyalty suddenly clashed with the reality of the numbers on the screen. The advisors attempted to explain their actions as strategic planning. They claimed the reserve fund was meant to safeguard the syndicate in case government investigations or rival factions threatened Jehun's leadership. But every explanation only made the situation worse, because each one confirmed the same truth. They had secretly moved $80 million out of Jehun's control. Eventually the noise faded when Jehun raised his hand. The captains fell silent immediately. He walked slowly toward the screen, studying the network of transactions one last time. When he finally turned around, his expression had changed. The calm authority that once protected the advisors had vanished. "You built a separate power base," he said. Neither advisor responded. "You believed this organization might need leadership that did not depend on me." Still they said nothing. Jehun's gaze moved across the room until it stopped on me. Only then did he seem to fully grasp what had happened during the last 6 months. While his advisors quietly redirected millions of dollars behind his back, the only person who had actually followed the money was the one the family had pushed out of the conversation. My laptop screen continued displaying the diagram behind me. 600 transactions. $80 million. Every line pointing to the same conclusion. The captains slowly turned their attention toward the advisors again. This time the anger in their eyes was unmistakable. One of them spoke in a low voice. "You blamed her." Another added, "You almost made us punish the only person who saw what you were doing." The advisors said nothing because there was nothing left to say. Jehun looked at the screen one final time before closing the laptop. Then he faced the room. "The only person who protected this organization," he said slowly, "was the one we refused to listen to." And for the first time since the missing money crisis began, no one in the room disagreed. The room slowly emptied after Jehun spoke. One by one the captains left the conference table, some shaking their heads, others whispering quietly to one another as the reality of what had almost happened settled in. The two advisors who had built the secret funnel of money no longer tried to defend themselves. They sat stiffly in their chairs while security escorted them from the building. $80 million had not only exposed their plan, it had exposed how easily the entire organization had been ready to sacrifice the wrong person. When the door finally closed behind the last captain, the headquarters floor fell silent. The harbor lights outside the tall windows flickered across the glass walls of the conference room. Container ships moved slowly through the dark water, carrying cargo that had built the Kong Empire for decades. Jehun remained standing near the table. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. He walked toward me slowly and stopped beside the laptop that had just dismantled 6 months of deception. For a moment he studied the closed screen, as if the numbers might still be visible through the metal casing. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not defensive, just heavy with the realization of everything that had gone wrong. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "I did tell you," I said. He frowned slightly. I continued calmly. "Twice." The memory returned to him immediately. The kitchen counter. The printed reports. The small transfers he had dismissed with a tired smile. Jehun exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand across his face. "I thought you were worrying about nothing," he admitted. "That was the problem," I replied. For years he had believed that protecting me meant keeping me away from the business. But protection had slowly turned into exclusion, and exclusion had made it easy for the wrong people to operate unnoticed. I picked up the laptop and slid it into my bag. I didn't expose them earlier because it wouldn't have mattered, I said. You trusted them. You trusted the family structure. Jehun did not deny it. He simply stood there, absorbing the truth. Outside the window, a cargo ship horn echoed across the harbor. Finally, he spoke again. You stayed, he said, even when they blamed you. I met his eyes. I stayed because someone needed to follow the money, I answered. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The empire he controlled was still intact, but the illusion that had supported it for years was gone. The advisors he trusted had tried to build power behind his back. The family he believed would protect itself had nearly destroyed the one person who actually understood what was happening. In the end, the truth had not come from loyalty. It had come from evidence. And in a world built on power, influence, and fear, the most dangerous weapon turned out to be something far simpler. A person who knew exactly where the money went. That night, the Kong Empire did not collapse. The ships still moved through Seattle's harbor. The casinos still opened their doors. The captains still answered to Jehun. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside that conference room, one truth had become impossible to ignore. For 6 months, the most powerful men in the organization failed to see $80 million slipping through their system. The only person who noticed was the one they treated like an outsider. I did not win by shouting or fighting. I simply followed the numbers until the truth had nowhere left to hide. In the end, power did not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the person who paid attention.